Imagine a world where your very existence is stripped of every identifying marker. Your name is replaced by a number. Your profession, your family, your dignity, and your hair are all shaved away. In this world, the odds of survival are mathematically negligible. 1 in 20? 1 in 28? The statistics vary, but the reality was absolute. Most died. And yet, amidst this industrial-scale eraser of the human soul, a specific, curious phenomenon emerged. It wasn't the physically strongest who survived the longest. It wasn't the most ruthless. It was those who possessed a very specific, invisible architecture of the mind. Those who had a reason to wait for tomorrow. Welcome to the audiobook Insights into one of the most profound psychological documents ever written. This is the deep dive into man's search for meaning. We begin our journey not in the camps themselves, but with the author's retrospective, looking back at a phenomenon he never intended to create. This is the preface to the 1992 edition by Viktor Frankl. When you hold a book that has sold millions of copies, appearing in dozens of languages, found on the nightstands of psychologists, theologians, and teenagers alike, you naturally assume the author intended to create a bestseller. You assume there was an ambition to be heard. But Viktor Frankl begins this definitive edition with a confession of reluctance. He tells us that his original intention was to publish this text anonymously. He wanted to strip his own name from the cover, just as his identity had been stripped in Auschwitz. He intended to sign it simply with his prisoner number, 119104.
Why? Because Frankl did not write this book to gain fame. He wrote it to convey a concrete, observational truth about human suffering. He wanted to prove a theoretical point through the raw data of lived experience. The point was simple yet revolutionary, that life holds a potential meaning under any conditions, even the most miserable ones. He felt that if he put his name on it, if he showed his face, the readers might focus on the man rather than the message. He wanted the text to stand alone as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, uncluttered by the ego of an author.
However, his friends convinced him otherwise. They argued that the validity of the testimony relied on the courage of the witness standing behind it. So at the last moment, before the manuscript went to press, he reinstated his name. And the result was a literary explosion that confused him as much as it gratified him.
Frankl addresses this success with a deeply humble, almost sociological perspective. He notes that the book has sold millions of copies in English alone. He asks a critical question. How can a book about such pain, such darkness, and such horror be a bestseller? What does that say about us, the readers? Frankl suggests that the success of man's search for meaning is not an achievement of the author, but an expression of the misery of our time. It is a symptom. If hundreds of thousands of people are reaching for a book that promises to explain the meaning of life, it essentially means that those hundreds of thousands of people are suffering from a lack of meaning. They are haunted by a hollow feeling, a burning internal void. They are searching for an answer to the question, why am I here? And if I am suffering, what is the point of it?
He describes this book as having two distinct halves, and it is vital we understand this structure before we descend into the narrative. The first half, titled Experiences in a Concentration Camp, is autobiographical. It is the raw data. It is the story of the prisoner. The second half, titled Logotherapy in a Nutshell, is the theoretical framework. It is the lesson distilled from the trauma. It is the cure. Frankl warns us that this is not a history book. He is not interested in the geopolitical scope of World War II or the military mechanics of the Holocaust. He is interested in the psychological landscape of the average prisoner. He is looking at the man in the corner of the hut, shivering, hungry, and terrified. He is asking, how does that man keep his mind intact?
In this preface, he also rededicates the 1992 edition to the memory of his mother, who died in the concentration camp of Auschwitz. This dedication grounds us immediately. We are reminded that while Frankl survived to write this theory, the cost was total. The wisdom we are about to explore was purchased with the highest currency imaginable. He wants us to understand that what follows is an attempt to make sense of the senseless. He tells us that he had to detach himself from the events as they were happening, to view them almost as a scientist observing an experiment, in order to survive them. This detachment allowed him to write the book, but it does not mean the pain was not felt. As we prepare to enter Part 1, Frankl leaves us with a guiding principle for the entire text. He quotes the philosopher Nietzsche, "He who has a why to live for can bear almost any how." This is the thesis. If you can find a purpose, a meaning, a why, then the how, the cold, the hunger, the beatings, the uncertainty, becomes bearable. If the why disappears, the human being collapses. The preface to the 1992 edition serves as a doorway. It prepares us for the fact that we are not just reading a memoir, we are analyzing the anatomy of hope itself. We are about to walk through the gates of the camp, not just to witness the horror, but to find the spark that resists it. Let us now turn the page and begin the descent. Part 1. Experiences in a concentration camp.
This does not begin with the gas chambers or the crematoriums. It begins with the train station. It begins with the confusion of transport. Frankl does not talk about the great heroes or the martyrs initially. He talks about the capos. To understand the psychology of the camp, we must understand the hierarchy. Frankl explains that the camps were not just run by the SS guards. They were run internally by prisoners. These were the capos, prisoners who acted as trustees, having special privileges. And here, Frankl delivers his first devastating psychological insight, one that challenges our comfortable assumptions about victimhood and morality. He observes that often the capos were harder on the prisoners than the guards were. They beat their fellow men more cruelly than the SS did. Why? Because a capo was fighting for his own survival in a zero-sum game. If he did not perform, he would be demoted back to the general population, which meant almost certain death. Therefore, the capos were selected from those prisoners whose characters promised to make them suitable for such procedures.
Frankl forces us to confront a dark truth. The process of selection in the camps was negative. The best of the prisoners, the most moral, the most ethical, the ones who refused to steal or beat others, usually did not survive. They died early. The ones who survived, and Frankl includes himself in this humble assessment, were often those who were willing to do whatever it took. They were the ones who for years had fought for existence. They had to be cunning. They had to be ruthless. They had to look away when others fell. He writes the chilling line, "We who have come back, we know, the best of us did not return." This sets the stage for everything that follows. We are not listening to the advice of a saint who floated above the suffering. We are listening to a man who admits he scraped and clawed his way through the mud, who saw the worst in humanity and the worst in himself, and yet still found a reason to say yes to life.
He explains that this story is not about the few famous camps like Auschwitz alone, but about the small, satellite camps where the real extermination through labor happened. He is focusing on the little man and his great suffering. He divides the psychological reaction of the prisoner into 3 phases. We must track these 3 phases carefully as we move through the text. Phase 1 is the period following admission, the shock. Phase 2 is the period when the prisoner is well entrenched in the routine of the camp, the apathy. Phase 3 is the period following release and liberation, the disillusionment and depersonalization. We are currently standing at the precipice of Phase 1. The train is slowing down. The whistle is blowing. The sign on the platform reads, Auschwitz. This concludes the introductory insights and the preface. We are now ready to step off the train. Part 1. Experiences in a concentration camp. Phase 1. The admission.
The first phase of camp life is defined by a single overwhelming psychological state, shock. Frankl brings us inside the cattle car as it shudders to a halt. There is a collective gasp as the passengers peer through the slats and see the sign, Auschwitz. The name alone evoked a physiological reaction, hearts pounding, pulses racing. It was a word synonymous with industrial death. But the human mind is a resilient, protective engine. Even in the face of absolute doom, it manufactures a specific defense mechanism that Frankl identifies as the delusion of reprieve. This is a critical psychological concept. The delusion of reprieve is the condition of a condemned man who, right up into the moment of his execution, clings to the irrational belief that he will be saved at the very last minute.
Frankl observes this delusion washing over the prisoners. They step off the train and see a group of inmates greeting them. These inmates look relatively well fed. They are speaking various languages. They seem to be laughing. The new arrivals think, surely this is not so bad. Surely we will be assigned to this group. We will be okay. They did not know that these greeting inmates were a shock troop, a special detachment specifically chosen to look healthy, to calm the new arrivals, and to process their belongings that often contained hidden jewelry and gold. The delusion was a necessary mercy. It allowed the prisoners to step off the train without collapsing into immediate insanity. Then begins the selection. This is perhaps the most chillingly bureaucratic moment in the entire book. It is the moment where the value of a human life is determined by a flick of a finger.
Frankl describes standing in front of an SS officer. The officer looks the prisoners over with a casual, almost bored detachment. He points a finger to the right or to the left. No words are spoken. No explanations are given.
Frankl is sent to the right. He doesn't know what it means. Later, he asks the veterans. They point to the chimney in the distance, where a column of fire is rising into the Polish night. That is where the path to the left led. To the left was the gas chamber. To the right was forced labor. In that single flick of a finger, 90% of Frankl's transport was sentenced to immediate death. This is the first lesson of the camp. Survival is arbitrary. It is not about merit. It is about luck. Those who went to the right were marched to a station for disinfection. Here, the stripping of identity becomes literal. They are told to leave their luggage, then their coats, then their clothes. They are ordered to strip completely naked. They are shaved, not just their heads, but their entire bodies. Frankl describes this moment as the reduction to naked existence. Consider that phrase, naked existence. For a man like Frankl, a professor of neurology and psychiatry, his identity was tied to his intellect, his status, his published papers, his suit, his watch. In the span of an hour, all of that is gone. Even his manuscript, the scientific work he had been hiding in his coat lining, the reason he felt he had to survive, is discovered and destroyed. He tries to plead with a guard, explaining that he is a scholar, that this book must be saved. The guard just looks at him and laughs. At that moment, Frankl realizes that his former life is entirely invalid. It is a dead currency. All he has left is his body, shivering, hairless, and vulnerable. But something strange happens in this state of shock. The mind detaches. Frankl notes that two sensations began to dominate: intense curiosity and a grim sense of humor. The curiosity was cold and clinical. It was the curiosity of a scientist watching a disaster. He thought, what will happen if I stand outside in the freezing cold, wet from the shower, completely naked? Will I get pneumonia? Will I die immediately? To his surprise, he did not. This led to a profound realization about the human body's adaptability. The medical textbooks, Frankl notes, are lies. They say a man cannot survive without a certain amount of sleep, or that he will die if he is exposed to certain temperatures. The camp proved that the human machine is capable of enduring far more than science previously believed. They slept 9 men to a narrow wooden tier, on top of each other, sharing 2 blankets, and yet they slept. They wore the same shirt for 6 months, and yet their skin did not rot off. The limits of the possible were expanding. Then there was the humor. Not the laughter of joy, but the grotesque humor of the condemned. It was a weapon of the soul in the fight for self-preservation. They made jokes about the showers. They made jokes about their nakedness. Frankl explains that humor, even in this dark form, is a way to rise above the situation, even if only for a few seconds. It creates a tiny distance between the sufferer and the suffering. However, the shock eventually gives way to the reality of death. Frankl discusses the thought of suicide. In the camp, this was known as running into the wire. The barbed wire fence was electrified. To touch it was instant death. Frankl made a promise to himself on that first night that he would not run into the wire. He reasoned deeply, using a cold calculus. The chances of survival were so slim, the probability of the gas chamber so high, that committing suicide was essentially redundant. Why rush to do what the camp would likely do for you anyway? He decided to let the experiment run its course.
This leads us to a crucial piece of camp terminology that Frankl introduces here: the Muslim. This is a specific term used by the prisoners. A Muslim, or Musulman, was a prisoner who had given up. You could see it in his eyes. He looked miserable, down and out, sick and emaciated. He stopped washing. He stopped trying to stand straight. He accepted his fate. Frankl learned quickly from a veteran prisoner that the moment you look like a Muslim, you are finished. The SS guards were watching. If a man looked too sick to work, he was selected for the gas. The advice the veteran gave was simple but vital. Shave. Use a piece of broken glass, use a sharp stone, but shave your face every day. Look younger, look ruddier, stand tall. Never walk slowly. Even if you are dying inside, you must project the image of utility.
This is the end of phase 1. The shock begins to wear off. The delusion of reprieve dissolves. The prisoner realizes that no one is coming to save him. The smoke from the chimney is real. The beatings are real. The hunger is real. As the days turn into weeks, the prisoner transitions into the second and longest psychological phase, apathy. We are now moving into the darkness of routine. The immediate fear of death is replaced by a profound emotional death.
Part 1. Experiences in a concentration camp. Phase 2. Apathy. We now enter the longest, bleakest stretch of the prisoner's existence. If phase 1 was the acute agony of the burn, phase 2 is the formation of the callus. This phase is characterized by a single, pervasive condition: apathy. Frankl describes this not as a simple lack of interest, but as a vital mechanism of self-defense. It is a kind of emotional death. In the first few days, if a prisoner saw a man being beaten, he would look away in horror, his heart racing, filled with pity and rage. But weeks later, if the same prisoner sees a comrade beaten to death or sees a corpse being dragged through the mud, he does not look away. He does not feel his pulse quicken. He stares, unmoved. He continues to eat his soup.
Why? Because the human soul cannot sustain high alert horror indefinitely. To survive, the prisoner had to blunt his feelings. He had to surround himself with a shell of indifference. This shell protected him from the daily assault of brutality. If he let himself feel every beating, every death, every injustice, he would shatter. Frankl illustrates this with a gruesome, specific memory. He describes sitting in a hut with typhus patients. These men dying, their bodies wasting away. One of them dies. What happens next is a study in pragmatic dehumanization. The other prisoners don't mourn. They don't pray. Instead, they immediately strip the corpse. One grabs the muddy shoes, another grabs the coat, another grabs a few crusts of bread from the dead man's pocket. Frankl watches this with no emotion. He simply asks the nurse to remove the body. When the nurse drags the corpse out by its feet, the head bumping hollowly against the steps, Frankl continues to sip his soup. The emotional connection to humanity has been severed. But amidst this apathy, Frankl identifies a nuanced source of pain that pierces through the shell. It isn't the physical pain of the beatings that hurts the most. It is the mental agony of the injustice. It is the insult.
He gives a vivid example. He is working on a railway track in a snowstorm. A guard stands over him, watching him struggle. Frankl is weak, starving, and moving slowly. The guard doesn't shout. He doesn't scream. He simply picks up a stone and casually tosses it at Frankl, the way a human would throw a stone at a stray dog or a beast of burden. That gesture, that casual, silent toss, hurt more than a whip. It signaled that Frankl was no longer a man worth speaking to. He was an animal, a thing. This realization that one has been completely ejected from the moral universe of mankind causes a spiritual agony that bruises deeper than the flesh. As the prisoner's higher emotions atrophy, his life regresses to a primitive level. Frankl notes that the psychoanalysts of his time, specifically the Freudians, believed that the sexual drive was the primary motivator of human behavior. The camps proved this wrong. In the camps, sex did not manifest, not even in dreams. The starvation was so absolute that the body simply shut down all non-essential functions. Instead, the primary drive became hunger. Frankl takes us into the obsessive, maddening conversation of the prisoners. When they weren't working, they talked about food. They planned imaginary feasts. They described recipes in minute, agonizing detail. One would describe a cake, another a specific type of bread. Frankl eventually had to stop these conversations, realizing they were psychologically dangerous. They were a form of torture. The body responded to the mental image of food, but the stomach remained empty.
The daily ration consisted of a watery soup and a small piece of bread. This bread was the most valuable object in the world. Frankl analyzes the psychology of eating this bread. There were two schools of thought. One group ate the bread immediately to silence the hunger pangs for a short while and ensure it wasn't stolen. The other group, to which Frankl belonged, divided the bread. He would save a tiny crumb for the afternoon to have a psychological weapon against the hardest part of the day. Holding that crumb gave him a tiny sense of control in a world where he controlled nothing. Despite this cultural hibernation, where art, philosophy, and high culture vanished, two things survived in the camp: politics and religion. Politics in the camp meant rumors, war news. Prisoners were obsessed with when the war would end. Contradictory rumors flew daily. The front is moving. The war is over. The Germans are winning. These rumors were dangerous. Optimism that was crushed by reality was a leading cause of death. When a promised liberation date came and went, men lost hope and died the next day.
Religion, however, was different. It was sincere and often deepened. Frankl describes improvised prayers in the corners of cattle trucks. He describes the spiritual life of the prisoners as something that grew more intense as the physical life decayed. This leads to one of the most beautiful and surprising paradoxes Frankl discovered. He calls it the intensification of the inner life. You might assume that as the body breaks down, the mind breaks down with it. But Frankl found that for sensitive people, intellectuals, people who had a rich cultural life before the camp, the damage to their inner self was often less severe than for the robust, physically strong men.
Why? Because the sensitive man could retreat. He had somewhere to go. He could escape the horror of the camp by diving into the past, into literature, into love. Frankl recounts marching to a worksite in the freezing dark. The guards are shouting, the stones are sharp, the pain is intense. But Frankl is not there. He is forcing his mind to think of his wife. He begins to have a conversation with her. He sees her smile. He hears her voice answering him. The hallucination is so vivid, it becomes more real than the guards. In this moment, Frankl stumbles upon a truth that poets and thinkers have proclaimed for centuries, but which he now validates with his life. The salvation of man is through love and in love.
He realizes that a man who has nothing left in this world may still know bliss, be it only for a brief moment, in the contemplation of his beloved. This inner hold, this ability to retreat into a secret garden of the mind, allowed the prisoners to find a refuge from the emptiness, desolation, and spiritual poverty of their existence. It was the first step in reconstructing the broken why. Part 1. Experiences in a concentration camp. Art, humor, and the relativity of suffering.
As the prisoner deepened his retreat into the inner life, a strange contradiction emerged. In the midst of filth and death, the appreciation for beauty did not vanish. It became sharper. Frankl recounts moments where the sheer aesthetic power of nature overwhelmed the prisoners. Imagine a group of men, exhausted, starved, shuffling in rags across the frozen ground. Suddenly, one of them points to the sky. They stop. They look up. The sun is setting, painting the Bavarian woods in colors that are impossibly vibrant, steely blues and blood reds. For a few minutes, the beatings and the hunger are suspended. One prisoner turns to another and says simply, "How beautiful the world could be." This appreciation extended, bizarrely, to art. Frankl describes a phenomenon that seems almost impossible to believe: a cabaret in the concentration camp. There was a hut cleared temporarily for this purpose. A wooden platform was erected, and here prisoners, mostly capos and those with some status, would gather to watch sketches, listen to songs, and hear poems. It was a surreal, grotesque performance. The audience laughed, they applauded, and for a few hours, they were allowed to forget. Frankl notes that this forgetting was so potent that some ordinary prisoners would sacrifice their daily ration of bread, their very lifeblood, just to gain admission to the cabaret. They were buying a momentary anesthesia. They were trading calories for an illusion of normalcy. This brings us back to the vital role of humor. We touched on this in the beginning, but Frankl expands on it here as a sophisticated tool of survival. He argues that humor is one of the weapons of the soul in the fight for self-preservation. It is the ability to rise above the situation. Frankl actively trained a fellow prisoner, a surgeon, in the art of camp humor. He proposed a game. They had to promise to invent at least one amusing story daily, specifically about some future incident after their liberation. They forced themselves to visualize the future, but to twist it with the habits of the camp.
For example, Frankl imagined standing at a formal dinner party years later. The soup is being served. In the camp, the most prized soup was from the bottom of the vat, where the few peas or potatoes settled. So in his imagination, Frankl sees himself forgetting where he is, turning to the elegant hostess and begging her, "Please ladle it from the bottom." This mental exercise created a barrier. It allowed them to look at their suffering not as a tragedy, but as an absurdity. If you can laugh at your own misery, you are no longer completely owned by it. But how do we measure this misery? How can we quantify the pain of a camp prisoner versus the pain of a free man? Here, Frankl introduces one of his most profound philosophical metaphors, the analogy of the gas chamber.
He asks us to imagine a room. If we pump a certain quantity of gas into this empty room, the gas will spread. It will fill the room completely and evenly, regardless of how big the room is. Frankl argues that suffering behaves exactly like a gas. Suffering fills the human soul and the conscious mind completely, no matter whether the suffering is great or little. Therefore, the size of human suffering is absolutely relative. This explains a crucial psychological reality. A man in a modern office who is slighted by his boss might feel a level of subjective anguish that fills his entire world. A prisoner in a camp who finds a lice in his shirt feels a level of anguish that fills his entire world. The objective scale of the tragedy is different, but the subjective experience of the suffering, the feeling of being completely consumed by it, is often the same. This theory of relativity works in reverse as well. It explains why the smallest mercy in the camp could produce a massive explosion of joy. Frankl calls this negative happiness. It is the philosophy of Schopenhauer. Happiness is simply the freedom from suffering. In the camp, happiness was not pleasure. It was merely the absence of pain. Frankl recalls being sick and allowed to stay in the hut for 2 days instead of working in the snow. To lie on the wooden boards, listening to the whistle blow for the work gangs outside, felt like being a king. He felt a profound gratitude simply because he was not out there in the storm. He gives us a striking example of this relative morality with the story of the cook, F. In the camp, the cook who dispensed the soup held the power of life and death. Most cooks had favorites. They would skim the watery top for strangers and dig deep for the potatoes for their friends. But Frankl describes a cook named F who was worshipped by the prisoners for one simple reason. He did not look at the men he served.
He stood behind the kettle and ladled the soup with absolute, blind impartiality. He gave the same scoop to everyone, regardless of who they were. In the starvation economy of the camp, this total lack of favoritism, this refusal to even look at the prisoner's face, was seen as the highest form of justice. Amidst this struggle for food and fairness, another instinct took over, the instinct of the herd. Frankl observes that human beings, when reduced to survival mode, try to disappear into the mass. We want to be in the middle of the formation. We don't want to be on the edge where the wind is coldest. We don't want to be in the front or the back where the guards' whips can reach. We want to be invisible. This constant immersion in the crowd produced a desperate craving for its opposite, solitude. In our modern world, we often fear being alone, but in the camp, privacy was the ultimate luxury. A prisoner was never alone. He marched with others, worked with others, ate with others, and slept with others piled on top of him. Frankl describes stealing away for a few moments to sit behind a typhus hut near a barbed wire fence. He would just sit there and look at the bodies of the dead being thrown into a makeshift mass grave. It sounds macabre, but to him, it was a sanctuary. For 5 minutes, he didn't have to talk. He didn't have to obey. He could just be. This need for privacy, for a reclaiming of the individual self from the mass was a critical step in maintaining sanity.
But the hardest test was yet to come. The physical suffering was one thing. The mental agony of deciding the fate of others was another. We are now approaching the moment where Frankl must make a choice that involves the life and death of a friend and the decision to escape. Part 1. Experiences in a concentration camp. Fate, the decision to escape, and the last human freedom.
We arrive now at the philosophical heart of the narrative. This is the pivot point where Frankl stops being an observer of suffering and becomes an architect of meaning. The question that plagued every prisoner was the question of fate. To what extent should one try to influence their own destiny? In the camp, the prevailing wisdom was to let fate take its course. It was considered dangerous to intervene. The logic was that the human mind, terrified and starved, could not possibly calculate the complex machinery of the Nazi death machine. Attempts to manipulate the system often backfired.
There is a story Frankl tells, a parable really, often referred to as Death in Tehran. A rich, powerful Persian walks in his garden with one of his servants. The servant cries that he has just encountered Death, who threatened him. He begs his master to give him the fastest horse so he can flee to Tehran, which he reaches that same evening. The master enters the garden, sees Death, and asks, "Why did you terrify my servant?" Death replies, "I did not threaten him. I only showed surprise in still finding him here when I planned to meet him tonight in Tehran." The prisoners felt this deeply. If you try to run, you might be running directly toward your appointment with Death.
Frankl himself wrestled with this. He describes a moment of agonizing choice. The battlefront was nearing the camp. He had an opportunity to escape. A colleague had devised a plan to smuggle them out during a chaotic transport of patients. Frankl gathered his few possessions, a torn blanket, a bowl, a pair of boots. But then he went to say goodbye to his patients. He stood over a young country doctor who was dying of typhus. The man looked up at Frankl with pleading eyes. He didn't say, "Don't go." He didn't have to. The look said everything. It asked, "Are you leaving me here to die alone?"
At that moment, the calculus of survival clashed with the moral imperative. Frankl stepped out of the hut. He paced in the cold. He weighed his life against his duty. And then he made a decision that defied all survival logic. He went back inside. He told the dying man he was staying. He threw his plan to escape away, and instantly the most profound sensation washed over him. It wasn't regret, it was peace. By choosing to stay, by choosing to face the danger rather than run from it, he had reclaimed his agency. He was no longer a leaf blowing in the wind of fate. He was a man who had made a choice. This leads us to the most famous, the most quoted, and the most vital concept in the entire book, the last human freedom.
Frankl poses a scientific question. We have spent chapters discussing how the camp destroyed the personality. We've talked about hunger, apathy, shock, and the reduction of man to an animal. So, must we admit that human behavior is the result of environment? Is a man nothing more than the product of his caloric intake and his sleep deprivation? Frankl answers with a thunderous no. He admits that the camp forces were powerful, but he insists that he witnessed exceptions. He saw men who walked through the huts comforting others, giving away their last piece of bread.
These men were few in number, but Frankl argues they offer sufficient proof that everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. Even when the gun is at your head, even when the hunger is gnawing at your belly, you still have a choice. You can choose to be a beast, fighting for a crust of bread, or you can choose to be a saint, breaking that bread in half for someone else. The camp could determine what happened to you. It could determine if you starved, if you froze, if you died. But it could not determine how you reacted to it. That inner territory remained unconquerable, unless the prisoner surrendered it voluntarily.
Frankl quotes Dostoevsky, "There is only one thing that I dread, not to be worthy of my sufferings." This is a radical shift in perspective. Usually, we think of suffering as something to be avoided, but Frankl suggests that suffering is a task. It is a challenge. To be worthy of your suffering means to bear it with dignity. It means that the way you suffer is a genuine inner achievement. This is what separated the men who crumbled from the men who sustained their spirits. The men who crumbled allowed their inner self to descend to the level of their outer conditions. They became the camp.
The men who survived, in the spiritual sense, treated their suffering as a temporary state, a test of their mettle. They looked at the mud and saw a path. They looked at the wire and saw a horizon beyond it. But this required a future, and this brings us to the danger of giving up. Frankl describes the specific pathology of the man who loses faith in the future. He calls it the loss of the spiritual hold.
He tells the tragic story of a friend, a senior block warden who had a dream. In February 1945, this man dreamed that a voice told him he could ask any question. He asked, "When will the war be over for me?" The voice answered, "March 30th. The man was filled with hope. He was convinced this was a prophecy. But as March 30th approached, the war news was bad. The front was not moving. On March 29th, the man suddenly became ill. On March 30th, he became delirious. On March 31st, he died. To the doctors, the cause of death was typhus. To Frankl, the cause of death was disappointed hope. The man's immunity relied on his belief in that date. When the date arrived, and freedom did not, his body simply gave up. The connection between the mind and the immune system was severed. This tragedy underscores Frankl's central thesis. A man who could not see the end of his provisional existence was unable to aim at an ultimate goal in life. He ceased living for the future, in contrast to a man in normal life. We must now learn how Frankl taught these broken men to find that future again. We are moving toward the specific therapeutic techniques he developed in the dark. We are moving toward the concept of the meaning of life itself.
Part 1. Experiences in a concentration camp, the meaning of life, and the psychology of the guard. We have arrived at the Copenhagen revolution of psychotherapy. In the depths of the camp, Frankl realized that the prisoners were asking the wrong question. They were looking at the gray sky and asking, "What can I expect from life?" If the answer was nothing, if no happiness was coming, if no rescue was imminent, they collapsed.
Frankl argues we must turn this question 180 degrees. It does not matter what we expect from life, but rather what life expects from us. Stop asking what the meaning of life is. Instead, recognize that you are the one being questioned. Life is putting a question to you, daily and hourly. The question is not abstract, it is concrete. It is, here's a difficult situation. How will you handle it? You do not answer with words or meditation. You answer with right action and right conduct. Life is a task.
Frankl compares it to a game of chess. If you ask a chess grandmaster, "What is the best move in the world?" they cannot answer you. There is no best move in the abstract. There is only the best move for this specific board, in this specific configuration, against this specific opponent. So it is with human existence. Your meaning is unique to you and unique to this moment. For the prisoner, the meaning wasn't to write a great novel or build a fortune. It was to endure the suffering in a way that did not betray his humanity. That was the assignment. But who were the enforcers of this assignment? Before we leave the camp, Frankl forces us to look at the psychology of the guards.
It is easy to paint the SS men as uniform monsters, sadists, purely born of evil. Frankl complicates this picture. He admits there were sadists, men who derived sexual pleasure from inflicting pain. But he notes that even the SS despised these men. The majority of the guards were not sadists. They were merely dulled. They had become morally numb. They watched the brutality so often that it became normal. But Frankl insists there were exceptions, even among the wearers of the swastika. He tells of a camp commander who secretly bought medicines for the prisoners from his own pocket. This leads to a startling conclusion. There are only two races of men in this world, not the Aryans and the Jews, not the rich and the poor. The two races are the decent men and the indecent men.
Both are found everywhere. They penetrate into all groups of society. There were decent guards, and there were indecent prisoners, the capos. No group is pure. The line between good and evil runs not between nations, but right through the middle of every human heart. And finally, the day comes. The white flag. Phase 3. Liberation.
We assume that the moment the gates opened, the prisoners broke into cheers, hugged each other, and danced. The reality was disturbingly different. Frankl describes the first walk out of the camp. They walked toward a meadow. The flowers were blooming, the sun was shining, but the men had no reaction. They could not feel it. The ability to feel joy had been cauterized. They had to relearn it, slowly, like a child learning to walk. Frankl calls this state depersonalization. Everything appeared unreal, unlikely, as in a dream. They couldn't believe it was true. They had been disappointed too many times.
When the body finally woke up, it didn't wake up with joy. It woke up with hunger. They ate. They ate for hours. They ate for days. Frankl describes a friend who ate continuously while talking. The pressure of years of silence was exploding. But with this release came a new danger: moral deformity. Some prisoners upon release felt that because they had suffered so terribly, they were now entitled to make others suffer. They felt above the law. Frankl recounts walking with a friend across a field of young oats. The friend began to trample the crops. Frankl tried to stop him. The friend exploded in rage. "You banish me from this field? My wife and child have been gassed, and you forbid me to tread on a few stalks of oats?"
Frankl had to gently guide these men back to the understanding that injustice does not justify further injustice. And then came the bitterness and disillusionment.
This was the hardest blow. A man survives for years, keeping the image of his wife in his mind. It is the only thing that keeps him alive. He walks back to his hometown. He knocks on the door, and a stranger opens it. No one is there. He finds out that no one awaits him. The reality he fought for has turned to ash. He faces the world and asks, why, and gets no answer. He encounters neighbors who shrug and say, "We didn't know," or "We suffered too." This disillusionment is the final test. If a man can survive the camp, can he survive the emptiness of the return?
Frankl ends part 1 with a personal image of redemption. He walks out into the country alone. He falls to his knees in the middle of a quiet field. The sky is expansive. The larks are singing. There is no barbed wire. He tries to pray, but his mind is empty. Only one sentence repeats in his mind from the Psalms: "I called to the Lord for my narrow prison, and he answered me in the freedom of space." He does not know how long he knelt there, but he knows that on that day, in that field, he started his life over. He stood up, a different man.
The journey through the hell of the camp is over. The prisoner has survived. Now, the professor must explain to us how to heal. We leave the narrative of the body and enter the narrative of the mind. Part 2. Logotherapy in a nutshell. We now leave the frozen earth of Poland and enter the lecture hall. The tone shifts here. It becomes less autobiographical and more analytical. Frankl is condensing decades of psychiatric theory into a compact, potent framework. He calls it logotherapy.
To understand this, we must look at the root word, logos. It is a Greek word which denotes meaning. Logotherapy, therefore, is a therapy entirely focused on the meaning of human existence, as well as on man's search for such a meaning. Frankl begins by distinguishing his theory from the two giants who came before him, Sigmund Freud and Alfred Adler. Freud believed the primary driver of human behavior was the will to pleasure. He believed we are driven by sexual instincts and the desire to reduce tension.
Adler believed the primary driver was the will to power. He believed we are driven by a need to overcome inferiority and gain superiority. Frankl disagrees with both. He argues that the primary motivational force in man is the will to meaning. We do not just want to feel good. We do not just want to be powerful. We want to know that our lives count for something. We are willing to suffer. We are willing to starve. We are willing to die if we know that there is a purpose behind it. Conversely, we can have all the pleasure and power in the world and still feel completely empty if we lack meaning.
Frankl introduces a specific diagnosis for this emptiness: the existential vacuum. This is a phenomenon of the modern world.
Frankl explains that humanity has suffered a dual loss. First, we lost our animal instincts that told us exactly what we must do to survive. Second, in modern secular society, we have lost the traditions that told us what we should do. Without instincts to drive us and without traditions to guide us, man often does not know what he wants to do.
The result is that he either does what other people do, which is conformism, or he does what other people wish him to do, which is totalitarianism. This vacuum manifests most clearly in a condition Frankl famously terms the Sunday neuroses. Think of the busy worker. All week he is distracted by the rush of business, the meetings, the deadlines. He is too busy to think. But then Sunday comes, the work stops, the phone stops ringing, and suddenly the void inside him opens up. He becomes aware of the lack of content in his life. He feels a profound, heavy boredom.
Frankl argues that boredom is now bringing more patients to psychiatrists than distress. We've solved the problem of survival, but we haven't solved the problem of purpose. This leads to what Frankl calls noogenic neuroses. This is a technical term, but the concept is simple. Noogenic comes from the Greek word nous, meaning mind or spirit. These are not mental illnesses caused by chemical imbalances or childhood trauma. These are problems arising from moral conflicts and existential crises.
If a patient comes to a doctor feeling depressed because they feel their job is pointless, they are not mentally ill in the traditional sense. They are spiritually frustrated. To treat this patient with Valium or antidepressants is to miss the point. You are numbing the symptom, but ignoring the cause. The patient needs to find a meaning, not a sedative.
He outlines 3 distinct avenues for arriving at meaning in life. Creating a work or doing a deed. This is the most obvious path. It is the path of the artist, the parent, the builder. You leave a footprint on the world. You contribute something that wasn't there before. Experiencing something or encountering someone. This is the path of love, of nature, of culture. By truly experiencing the beauty of a sunset, or by loving another human being in their uniqueness, you fulfill a meaning. Frankl emphasizes that love is the only way to grasp another human being in the innermost core of his personality.
The attitude we take toward unavoidable suffering. This is the most challenging and the most relevant to his time in the camp. This third point is crucial. Frankl is not saying suffering is necessary to find meaning. If suffering is avoidable, for example, if you have a tumor that can be removed by surgery, then the meaningful thing to do is to remove it. To suffer unnecessarily is not heroic, it is masochistic. But if the suffering is unavoidable, if the tumor is inoperable, if the loss is permanent, if the camp gates are locked, then the meaning is found in how you bear it. By rising above the tragedy, you transform it into a human triumph.
Frankl gives a poignant clinical example. An elderly general practitioner came to him, suffering from severe depression. The man's wife had died 2 years earlier, and he loved her above all else. He could not get over the loss. Frankl did not offer him pills. He asked him a simple question. "Doctor, what would have happened if you had died first, and your wife would have had to survive you?" The doctor said, "Oh, for her, this would have been terrible. How she would have suffered."
Frankl replied, "You see, doctor, such a suffering has been spared her, and it is you who have spared her this suffering. But now you have to pay for it by surviving and mourning her." The man said nothing. He shook Frankl's hand and left the office. The pain was still there, but the suffering had changed. It now had a meaning. It was the price he paid to save his beloved from the pain of widowhood. Meaning did not erase the tragedy, but it made it bearable. This is the core of logotherapy. It is about reframing the narrative of your life so that you are not a victim, but a protagonist facing a challenge.
Postscript 1984. The case for a tragic optimism. We have traveled from the depths of Auschwitz to the clinical heights of logotherapy. Now we arrive at the final major addition to the text. This is the Postscript 1984, titled The Case for a Tragic Optimism. This section was written decades after the original manuscript. Frankl is older now. He is looking at a world that has moved on from the war, but has fallen into a new kind of despair. He poses a difficult question. Is it possible to say yes to life, not only despite pain and death, but perhaps even because of them?
He introduces a concept he calls the tragic triad.
Human existence, he argues, is inevitably composed of three negative factors. No human being is exempt from them: pain, suffering.
Guilt, death. The question of tragic optimism is this: how can one remain optimistic in the face of this triad?
Frankl warns us immediately against false optimism. He's not talking about forcing a smile or pretending things are fine when they are not. He is talking about a genuine optimism that acknowledges the tragedy but refuses to be crushed by it. He breaks down the triad, offering a form of alchemy for each element, a way to turn the negative lead into positive gold. First, pain. We have already discussed this extensively. The alchemy of pain is to turn suffering into a human achievement. When we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves.
Second, guilt. This is a heavy burden for many. We look back at our lives, at our mistakes, at the people we hurt, and we feel crushed. Frankl argues that guilt is necessary. A man without guilt is a sociopath, but to wallow in guilt is useless. The alchemy of guilt is to use it as a spur for self-improvement. If you have done wrong, you cannot undo the past, but you can change the future. You can ensure that the you of tomorrow is better than the you of yesterday. Guilt is the fuel for transformation. Third, death. We fear death because it seems to erase everything. It is the final period at the end of the sentence. Frankl flips this. He argues that death is actually the very thing that gives life its urgency. If we were immortal, if we had infinite time, we could postpone everything. We could say, I will write that book in 1,000 years, or I will forgive my brother in 1,000,000 years. Nothing would matter because nothing would be final. But because we die, every moment is unique and unrepeatable. The alchemy of death is to view it as an incentive to responsible action. We must act now because we will not be here forever. Frankl then turns his gaze to the culture of the United States. He offers a sharp, loving critique of the American obsession with happiness. He notes that the Declaration of Independence speaks of the pursuit of happiness, but Frankl argues that this is a semantic trap. Happiness cannot be pursued. It must ensue. You cannot wake up and say, today I will be happy. If you try to force happiness, you will fail. Happiness is a byproduct. It is the side effect of forgetting yourself. It happens when you surrender yourself to a cause or to a person you love. The more you aim at happiness, the more you miss the target. He contrasts this with the modern mass neurosis. He looks at the youth of the 1980s and, by extension, the youth of today, and sees a generation suffering from a lack of meaning. He identifies a neurotic triad that mirrors the tragic triad.
Depression, aggression, addiction. He argues that all three are symptoms of the existential vacuum. When a young person feels their life has no point, they may sink into depression, or they may lash out in aggression, violence born of frustration, or they may try to numb the emptiness with addiction, drugs, alcohol, or mindless entertainment. Frankl cites studies showing that addiction rates are highest among those who score lowest on tests of purpose in life. The drug is not the problem. The drug is the solution the patient is using to fix the problem of emptiness. So, what is the answer for this modern despair? Frankl returns to the concept of the best. He quotes the Latin phrase, optimum sed non populare, the best but not valid for the masses. He argues that meaning is elitist, not in terms of money or class, but in terms of character. Decency is rare. The capacity to find meaning in tragedy is a high bar, but it is a bar we must all strive for. He concludes this postscript with a powerful reminder that the world is in a bad state, but everything will become still worse unless each of us does his best. We are not just responsible for our own meaning, we are responsible for the moral climate of the world. By finding meaning in our own lives, we add a little bit of light to the collective darkness. This brings us to the very end of the theoretical framework. The only thing left is the afterword and the conclusion, where we will synthesize this massive journey into a final takeaway. Afterword. The journey through the text is complete, but the story of the man is not. To fully understand the weight of man's search for meaning, we must look at the life that followed the liberation. This is the afterword.
It is easy to imagine Viktor Frankl as a somber, grave figure, a man permanently shadowed by the smokestacks of Auschwitz. But those who knew him paint a radically different picture.
They describe a man of immense vitality, wit, and humor. We learn here that Frankl was not just a survivor, he was an adventurer. At the age of 67, a time when most men retire to the armchair, Frankl began taking flying lessons. He earned his pilot's license. Why? Because he wanted to prove that one is never too old to master a new challenge. He also had a passion for mountain climbing. He was still scaling the treacherous peaks of the Alps well into his old age. There is a profound symbolism in this. The man who was once forced to march in the mud, head bowed, spent the rest of his life looking up, climbing toward the sky. He refused to be defined by the lowest point of his existence. He insisted on ascending. In this afterword, we are also reminded of a specific metaphor Frankl loved to use regarding human potential. It comes from his flying lessons. It is the concept of crabbing. In aviation, if there is a crosswind and you fly the plane directly at the landing strip, the wind will push you off course and you will miss the runway. To land safely, the pilot must aim the nose of the plane into the wind. He must aim at a point that seems to be above the destination.
Frankl applied this to human beings. He said, if we take man as he is, we make him worse. But if we take man as he should be, we make him capable of becoming what he can be. We must crab into the wind. We must overestimate people. We must treat them not as they are, but as the potential they hold inside. If you treat a student or an employee or a child as if they are already noble and capable, they will strive to meet that expectation. If you treat them as average, they will sink to the average. The afterword also contextualizes the book's legacy. We are told that the Library of Congress named Man's Search for Meaning one of the 10 most influential books in America. It sits alongside the Bible and the founding documents.
Why does it have this power? Because it is not a lecture, it is a testimony. It is the only book that looks the worst of humanity in the eye and doesn't blink, yet still offers a hand to pull us up. Frankl died in 1997. He left behind a world that is still struggling with the same questions he answered in the camps. He left us with a final challenge. He often said that the United States has a Statue of Liberty on the East Coast. He suggested that to complete the picture, the West Coast should have a Statue of Responsibility. Freedom, he taught, is only half the truth. Freedom without responsibility is arbitrary. It is merely chaos. We are free from tyranny, yes, but what are we free for? We are free to be responsible for our neighbors, for our work, and for our suffering. Conclusion: we have now reached the end of our deep dive into man's search for meaning. We began on a train platform in Poland, surrounded by the hiss of steam and the shouting of guards. We were stripped naked, shorn of our hair, and robbed of our names. We descended into the shock of admission, walked through the long gray apathy of camp routine, and faced the temptation to run into the wire.
We learned that the best of us did not return. We learned that survival was often a matter of luck, but that sanity was a matter of choice. We discovered that the last human freedom is the ability to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances. We learned that he who has a why to live for can bear almost any how. We transitioned from the horror of the camp to the healing of logotherapy. We realized that we are not the ones asking life what it means. Life is asking us. We are being questioned by the hour, and our answer must not be in words, but in right action.
We explored the tragic triad of pain, guilt, and death, and found the alchemy to transform them into achievement, improvement, and responsible action. So, what is the final takeaway? What do you do with this massive script of wisdom? You look at your own life. You look at the things you complain about, the traffic, the difficult boss, the financial stress, and you apply the scale of the camp. You realize your suffering is relative. But more importantly, you look for the vacuum. Do you feel empty? Do you feel bored? If so, stop chasing happiness. Stop chasing success. Instead, find a cause to serve. Find a person to love. Find a challenge to overcome. Viktor Frankl's voice reaches out from the 20th century to tell you one simple thing. You are not a victim of your biology. You are not a victim of your parents. You are not a victim of your circumstances. You are the pilot of your own soul. The wind is blowing, the storm is raging, but you have the controls. aim high. This concludes the audiobook Insights into Man's Search for Meaning.